Long History's Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 18, Robert Banks Jenkinson, Waterloo and Peterloo. He was Prime Minister between 1812 and 1827. Hello everyone and welcome to Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Now the biographies don't really seem to have anything exceptional to say about Robert Banks Jenkinson, our Prime Minister of the Week. He was in office in the early 1800s and doesn't seem to have any eccentricities or peculiar traits. But he was nevertheless in the office for 15 years. He was the third longest serving Prime Minister ever. Now that's extraordinary. So what made him so special, yet forgettable? The positive sides of his premiership came with that Battle of Waterloo mentioned in the title. It ended decades of war in Europe. The ambiguities of the times, however, are perhaps better summed up with another standout event during his premiership, the Peterloo Massacre. We'll explain this in more detail in this episode. During Robert Banks Jenkinson's premiership, the disastrous Corn Laws were introduced, and there were growing calls for electoral reform which he resisted. So far we've had wars, starvation, massacres and reforms. Not exactly a boring time, but it's a mixed legacy for a Prime Minister, including decisions both as celebrated and as disastrous as government choices can get. So how was a supposedly uninteresting man in power so long, presiding over so many interesting events? We'll look at the evidence throughout this episode. He's one of only 4 Prime Ministers to have won 4 general elections, the others being Harold Wilson, William Gladstone and Robert Walpole. We've done episodes on all these Prime Ministers. There's a sense that he straddled 2 eras. He was the last of those old-style, long-ruling Georgian Prime Ministers who stayed in office mainly because they had the ability to keep calm and carry on, and to keep the right people, not least Georges III and IV in Banks Jenkinson's case, happy. But, unlike Walpole and Pitt the Younger, those 2 other extraordinarily long-serving Georgian Prime Ministers, the Victorian era was just around the corner. Banks Jenkinson was clinging on to the old way of doing things, with official backing, even though it was becoming increasingly clear that the world was moving on, whether the UK establishment liked it or not. The American Revolution and the French Revolution had started something that wasn't going to be stopped. What was Robert Banks Jenkinson like? As we've already stated, it's a bit difficult to pin him down. The biographies looked at for this episode don't seem to be able to make up their minds about him, making him seem quite elusive. On the one hand, he's said to be dry, stable and uninteresting, yet one possibly more perceptive commenter pointed out that his air of quiet competence could easily have been a well-rehearsed facade of an experienced politician rather than his true personality. A later Prime Minister, the much more charismatic Benjamin Disraeli, called him an arch-mediocrity. This was still the Georgian era, however, and during that time roles such as Prime Ministers were not the same as they are today, and they'd already evolved by the time Disraeli became Premier. The aristocracy, with the king on top, still had the final say on matters when Banks Jenkinson was in power, and the Prime Minister worked more as a deputy in lieu of the king than as the leader of the country, which meant that keeping these powerful figures happy was the most important need. So actually, a lack of personality was preferred in this scenario. An inspirational type of leader was simply not needed. In the episode on Pitt the Younger, we resorted to the cliché of keeping the ship sailing smoothly through stormy waters, and it also applies here. As we've already alluded to, he was against 2 of the key issues of his times, electoral reform and the Catholic issue, that is, whether Catholics should be treated on the same terms as Protestants. He was against reform for both these matters, and these beliefs both reveal how he stayed in office so long. He was keeping the old ways going, revealing a rather conservative personality. What was the historical background? The Napoleonic Wars ended during his time in office in 1815, But they'd been running since 1803, and even they followed wars that stemmed back to the French Revolutionary Wars beginning in 1792. Jenkinson was therefore the sixth Prime Minister to serve since the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars in 1803, which is perhaps part of the reason why he doesn't seem to gain much credit for the end of the war, unlike, for example, Lloyd George's First World War, Churchill's Second World War, Palmerston's Crimean War, and even Thatcher's Falklands War. The Battle of Waterloo finally ended it all thanks to another future Prime Minister, the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. And this definitive ending, attributed largely to Wellington after all those messy years, is perhaps another reason why Banks Jenkinson did not get so much of the credit. The war ended, but these were tense times. Banks Jenkinson came into power after one Prime Minister was assassinated, Spencer Perceval. Another term from the time also highlights the tensions in society, Luddite. This was apparently named after a man called Ned Ludd, although the origins of the term and even of this man are disputed. The term referred to a movement between 1811 and 1816 to resist the surging development in automated technology. Does that ring a bell? It added to the general sense of a population losing grips on developments and wanting control back. Who says that history doesn't repeat? Such issues arose due to the poor economy of the time, as the country recovered from war, and it wasn't helped by poor harvests. Things came to a head in August 1819 when a group of people gathered in Manchester to listen to speakers asking for electoral reform. Manchester and other burgeoning cities in the country did not have any specific political representation at the time, despite their central role in the country's industrial revolution. What would become known as the Peterloo Massacre took place in Manchester when this gathering was charged by the armed forces with sabres, leading to the death of 18 people and around 400 other people being injured. Banks Jenkinson's opinion on the issue reflects the attitude of the powers that be at the time. He felt that it was better to clamp down on this irregular behaviour, keeping this minority of people under control so that the majority of people could live in peace, and in this way he'd protect the country and the rule of law. One biography states that Jenkinson was actually a moderate voice in the political reaction to the massacre. It would be another 13 years, however, before the authorities, reluctantly even then, began to tackle the issue of electoral reform, and only then would Manchester get its own members of Parliament. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein both appeared during these years. What was happening in the US at the time? The fourth, fifth and sixth presidents, James Madison, James Monroe and briefly John Quincy Adams, would hold power in the US while Robert Banks Jenkinson was Prime Minister. 7 states would enter the US during these years, one of its most formative periods: Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Maine and Missouri. The US and the UK were actually at war during the first 2 or 3 years of Banks Jenkinson's premiership, particularly over who controlled the Great Lakes area of the United States. The indigenous people overall seem to have been the people who lost out, however, with the US and the UK's North American borders remaining the same both before and after the war. Now, there might be some details here not taken into account during the brief research on this topic, but this could be said to be the time when the long alliance between the US and the UK began, after years of tension following American independence. Who could vote? Part of the reason Banks Jenkinson is not given more credit for ending the Napoleonic Wars is because before 1832, when those electoral reforms eventually took place, perhaps a Prime Minister did not need to seek such credit, with such gestures only becoming important when the vote was widened out to the wider population. The old system, where only a few members of the aristocracy and the landed gentry had a vote, was still in place for now, as were those rotten boroughs where only a few people could influence who would enter Parliament. Banks Jenkinson is most notable for resisting electoral reforms. After American independence and the French Revolution, it was becoming increasingly clear that some sort of change was needed in the country, but those changes would have to hold off for now. What was Banks Jenkinson's background? Apparently, one branch of Banks Jenkinson's family tree could be traced back to the Portuguese community of India. He's therefore possibly the first Prime Minister to have some family link to India. This was through his mother's side, through relatives who had worked for the East India Company. Banks Jenkinson was born in 1770 to a political family, his father also being a politician. This was also the man who would eventually become the first Earl of Liverpool. Banks Jenkinson's mother died shortly after he was born, leaving him an only child until his father got married again over a decade later. He went to a very establishment school, Charterhouse, although he's actually the only Prime Minister to have been educated there. Then he went on to become one of the 30 Prime Ministers to study at Oxford University. He was one of a generation of Prime Ministers who were heavily influenced by the French Revolution and its effects. At the age of 19, apparently, Banks Jenkinson went to France and actually saw the storming of the Bastille himself. This eyewitness view of the revolution and its effects on the establishment of France clearly had a deep influence on him, leading to a conservative outlook and an emphasis on the protection of the UK's establishment as it was. It influenced him throughout his political career. He entered Parliament at the age of 20 in 1790 and served in various roles over the years, becoming a prominent member of the Tory grouping of politics, particularly supporting Pitt the Younger during his premiership. Banks Jenkinson's most significant achievement before his premiership was perhaps the signing of the Treaty of Amiens, which would end the French Revolutionary Wars, which were the precursor to the Napoleonic Wars. Banks Jenkinson married twice, to Louisa Harvey in 1795, and after she died in 1821, to Mary Chester. He had no children. How did Banks Jenkinson become Prime Minister? Pitt the Younger resigned as Prime Minister in 1801 over the issue of the rights of Catholics. He thought that they should be treated on the same terms as Protestants, but Banks Jenkinson, and more importantly George III, disagreed on that point. Pitt had been in office for 18 years, and then a quick succession of 5 premierships began, including a return by Pitt, only for him to die in office. Pitt had successfully managed to save the establishment from the immediate aftermath of both US independence and the French Revolution, but now the Napoleonic Wars were threatening the UK, and within the country, rebellion was stirring. In the meantime, Jenkinson became the second Earl of Liverpool due to the death of his father in 1808. The assassination of Spencer Perceval on the 11th of May 1812 perhaps reflects the turbulence of these particular times, although the reasons for the assassination itself are rather abstruse actually. See the episode on Spencer Perceval for more details. By 1812, therefore, Banks Jenkinson had been in politics for over 3 decades, so was a very experienced politician and a clear candidate for the job. He soon took over after the assassination of his predecessor. What were Banks Jenkinson's biggest achievements as Prime Minister? His first key move, and perhaps a lesson that can be learned by today's politicians, was to put aside the Catholic issue, saying that it was open to individual consciences. This astute tactic managed immediately to bypass the issue, even though it wasn't resolved. In his first 3 years as Prime Minister, the Napoleonic Wars were the main issue. It was the Duke of Wellington, however, who would gain all the glory for the eventual victory, which came with the final climax of decades of war, this Battle of Waterloo, on the 18th of June 1815. Napoleon was finally exiled to St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic. Banks Jenkinson's response to the Peterloo Massacre was to pass laws suppressing any gathering which asked for electoral reforms. Even now, Peterloo is the kind of event that makes the establishment twitchy. When the Napoleonic Wars ended, the recession came when people realised they had to pay for it. And Banks Jenkinson's response was the introduction of the catastrophic Corn Laws, which were actually designed to protect landowners during times of inflation. We've already said that Banks Jenkinson is the 3rd longest serving Prime Minister, so that's one of his achievements. But it is noticeable that these longest premierships all happened in the early days of Prime Ministers. And as more people got the vote, premierships began to grow shorter. and it wouldn't be until Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s when there would be even as remotely long a single premiership. Why did Banks Jenkinson stop being Prime Minister? The 1820s dawned with a new king, when George III, who had reigned for 40 years, that's a record in itself for a male monarch, was replaced by George IV, who would reign until 1830. During the later years of his premiership, Banks Jenkinson's stance apparently became more moderate as the economy began to recover. During that time, some oppressive laws were withdrawn. For example, the death penalty would be used much less frequently after an 1822 law, and that ability to hold so-called seditious meetings, banned after the Peterloo Massacre, was withdrawn in 1824. Banks Jenkinson would, however, continue to be Premier until 1827. He had a stroke on the 28th of February and was replaced by George Canning as Premier 2 months later. He would go on to die on the 4th of December of the same year at the age of 58. Why should we remember Banks Jenkinson? Overall, Banks Jenkinson seemed to be the last gasp of the Georgian establishment's attempt to hold on to the past. Despite victories in the wars and a stable premiership, taken together, his decisions seem to be rather backward-looking and ungenerous, really, in hindsight. The establishment, and particularly Banks Jenkinson, could have given the public what they wanted, but they were so afraid of change, influenced by the shock of the French Revolution and its bloody aftermath, that they barely budged. One key aim at that time was to make sure that revolution didn't happen on the British side of the Channel. In that respect, Jenkinson succeeded. However, transformational electoral reform took place just 7 years after Banks Jenkinson's premiership. The Victorian era would begin only 12 years after Banks Jenkinson was in charge, so the country was desperate to move forward, even if the authorities were scared of the repercussions of such changes. If Banks Jenkinson was holding on to the past, it crumbled when he left the job. He held the top job for 15 years, yet in the next 12 before Victoria became Queen, there would be another 6 Prime Ministers, 2 of them serving twice in a total of 8 premierships. So one conclusion is that the supposed stability provided by Banks Jenkinson actually were just trying to drown out the many tensions that would inevitably rise to the surface at some point, leading to what, with hindsight, can be said to be inevitable, or at least long overdue, electoral reform. Banks Jenkinson was in office for so long that we've left out lots along the way, not least about the Napoleonic Wars, that war with America, the recessions of the time, and also regarding Banks Jenkinson's relationship with George IV. One major scandal of those years took place when the king and his wife got divorced. Of all the events that took place during Banks Jenkinson's time in office, Waterloo and Peterloo are the ones that stand out, in a way being 2 sides of the same coin. The former was the result of the seismic changes that were taking place on the European continent, whereas the latter was perhaps a delayed reaction to those changes in the UK itself. Thank you for listening to this episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Banks Jenkinson has a rather debatable legacy. He provided the country with stability at a time when the European continent was tearing itself apart. Yet, at the same time, he was postponing those inevitable reforms. Thank you for listening, everyone. I hope that was an enjoyable episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. As always, don't forget that this is just the briefest of introductions to a Prime Minister. I myself would be interested to know more about the personality of this man, and why he managed to be Prime Minister so long when there were so many Prime Ministers either side of his tenure. However, that's it for now. Thank you for listening, everyone. This was Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 18, Robert Banks Jenkinson, Waterloo and Peterloo. Goodbye.